Brien Foerster, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Now, you're based in Peru, aren't you?
Yes, that's true. I'm presently in Cusco. We just finished a tour with some people from United Arab Emirates, but our base is in a small town just south of Lima on the coast.
Okay, and what made you go all the way to sort of be based out in Peru and not to sort of look back or want to come back to Canada?
Well, actually, I started my study of native indigenous cultures when I was a child in Canada on the west coast. And I did that for a number of years, including becoming a professional totem pole carver at the age of 26. And I continued doing that until about the age 35. And I was just drawn to go to Hawaii, so I explored the Polynesian cultures for a number of years. And then, for some reason, I was drawn to Peru, so here I am.
Now, you study, one of your main theses is obviously the Inca. That's what you've been studying for many, many years. And, you know, what can you tell us about the Inca? How did the Inca start off to begin with?
Well, the basic story is that the Inca emigrated from the Lake Titicaca area, most likely Tiwanaku, which is presently in Bolivia, or at least the border is just north of Tiwanaku. And they emigrated from there about 900 AD as a result of a major catastrophic El Nino weather event that lasted 40 years. So they were not able to grow food. And so they emigrated up north to what is presently called Cusco.
Now, you've done a number of books on the Inca, and was one of your first books, I believe, was A Brief History of the Inca, From Rise to Regime to Ruin. Just tell us a bit about that book as well.
Okay, well, that book basically covers the birth of the Inca as a people around Lake Titicaca, their founding of Cusco, and then their fall as a result of contact with the Spanish in 1532. So it's basically a time span from 900 AD until actually 1533, when they were basically, the civilization was crushed by the Spanish.
So what sort of, amazed you about the Inca civilizations? I mean, what sort of surprises you about it?
Well, the basic thing was the fact that they were the largest, physically the largest civilization in the Americas, stretching from the middle of Chile in the south, north to Colombia, west to the Pacific Ocean, and east into the Amazon. And so, beyond that, I wanted to study how it was that they were able to create such a large civilization, and that led to the first book. But after that, I started to find out that many of the megalithic structures were in fact not built by the Inca, but are probably thousands of years older than them.
So how old are they?
Well, we're guessing that there were at least two periods, two great civilizations that preceded them, one about 12,000 years ago, and the other possibly 24,000 years ago. So they are in relation to, what is known as the precession of the equinox cycle that lasts 26,000 years, and approximately every 13,000 years, the Earth undergoes a major cataclysmic event. So what we believe is that these two civilizations rose and then basically fell as the result probably of some kind of earth, massive earth change,
Yeah.
The last one being the end of the Ice Age.
So, I mean, who was this other civilization that you just referred to?
Well, that's basically what I'm still studying. We don't really have much information about them except for the megaliths that were left behind. We don't have real names for them. We've given them the names. The first one we call the Hanan Pacha, which means the high civilization, and then the second is the Uran Pacha, which is the middle civilization, and the Inca were the third, called the Ukun Pacha, and those terms are based on the Quechua language. So it seems to us, not just me, but other researchers here and farther afield, including people like Graham Hancock, who I write articles for, and also Hugh Newman and many different people, that it was actually the oldest civilization was the highest, the most sophisticated, and it's been actually a descent since then, with the Inca being the last holders of the great, one could say, hidden knowledge.
Right. And have other researchers looked into what you're now researching? I mean, and what did they discover, if they have?
Well, not really. The main researcher that I know of, at least, is Jesus Gamarra, who lives in Cusco, and he's really only known within the city of Cusco and slightly farther afield. But I seem to be in the middle of it, more or less trying to find the bits and pieces of information that I can from those that carry the oral traditions here, but also basing a lot of my fundamental research on Fingerprints of the Gods, for example, by Graham Hancock, and the works of some other non-conventional academics.
I mean, how advanced, was the cities that the Inca, I suppose, inhabited?
Well, what it seems is that the conventional story is that the Inca were forced to migrate north. They found the area, which is now called Cusco, that was inhabited by very primitive people, and the Inca were the great teachers in terms of agriculture, metallurgy, basically all the arts and sciences, and that their civilization, sprang from Cusco and expanded north, south, east, and west. But I'm starting to feel that the Inca actually returned to Cusco, and that there were buildings here that preceded them by, again, 12 to 24-ish thousand years. And what they did is they simply moved into them, adopted them, and then built the city around these ancient structures. And there is evidence outside of Cusco in the Sacred Valley, including Machu Picchu itself.
And how perfect were these ancient structures? I mean, I've seen some of the pictures on your website, which we'll give the link for very soon, and they just seem to have been sandblasted. They're just so smooth.
Well, that's what's astonishing. I've been talking quite a lot with Christopher Dunn, who wrote the Giza Power Plant, which some people may have read. And yeah, the technology, they obviously had technology, not necessarily technology as we know it, but clearly they had technology beyond the conventional thought of that which the Inca had, which were bronze chisels and stone hammers. They seem to have had some kind of ultrasonic machine that was able to cut stone in perfect straight lines, not lasers, because Chris Dunn has very strongly debunked the idea that lasers can cut stone, but he believes that some sort of ultrasonic or ultra high vibrational device was employed in order to have the stones fit perfectly together.
I mean, again, going back to the Inca, was there any sort of stories which, came out to say that basically, we did not build these cities, we just inhabited them?
Well, that's a very good point. If you read the ancient or the old chronicles, the Spanish ones and also the ones written by the descendants of the Inca, they do say that, for example, Sacsayhuaman, which is on the hill above Cusco and has the largest stones, some being larger than 120 tons, and again perfectly fitting together. When the first Spanish arrived and were shocked at the scale of construction, they asked the Inca, they asked the Inca, "Did you build these?" And they said no. And the same with when the first Spanish went to Tiwanaku and Pumapunku. They were astonished by not only the size of the stone, but the incredible accuracy of the cutting and smoothing of the surface of this very, very hard stone. And again, the local people and the Inca who accompanied them said, no, we didn't build these. These were built long before we existed.
So how complex is some of the stone masonry work? I mean, how detailed is it? I mean, how closely do some of these blocks fit in with each other as well?
Well, the most amazing examples are at Pumapunku, which is located on the Tiwanaku site. It's actually, unfortunately, only 5 to 10% of the visitors to Tiwanaku see Pumapunku, but the level of craftsmanship is absolutely astonishing. It does look like they had electrical or vibrational router-like tools, as well as drill presses that were able to cut perfect channels, smooth, perfect flat surfaces, and drill holes into diorite, which is on the so-called Mohs scale from 0 to 10, which is a gauge of hardness of stone, with diamond being 10. These are about 7. So it is, to me, it's the most mind-boggling sight I've ever seen in the world.
So you're saying that the stones that they're made out from, you can't sort of cut these with, they're not like, soft stone. You can't just go back into the technology that the Inca maybe would have had. Their tools would have been broken, wouldn't they, from some of this hardened stone that you're sort of, describing here?
Oh, exactly. The bronze chisels would have bent within 2 or 3 strikes, and also the diorite stone was brought from at least 90 kilometers away. So it's not only the accuracy of the workmanship, it's the fact that they were able to move multi-ton stones across, at least 90 kilometers distance.
Well, that's it. I mean, how did they move them?
Well, that's one of the big questions. The conventional answers are really quite... Unfortunately, the conventional academic stories are quite, I find, hilarious, because they say that either they used wooden rollers, and the fact that there are no trees in the area is one thing, and the other idea is that they were floated across Lake Titicaca on reed boats. And some of these stones are 40 tons, which is the weight of at least 20 automobiles.
So there must be a connection with these ancient structures and obviously the pyramids, because we are talking the sort of same weights and the same sort of sizes, are we not?
Well, that's true, and of course the red granite from that make up a lot of the interior of the Great Pyramid and other structures comes from Aswan, which is 500 miles away. I'm very thankful to be connected again with people such as Christopher Dunn and also Stephen Mailer, who have, Chris has been to Egypt at least a few times with his measuring instruments that he uses as an engineer, and Stephen has been visiting Egypt for at least 20 years and is a major student of the oral traditions of the Comitian people, who are the true descendants of the great pyramid builders, not the pharaohs. The pharaohs came later. And I'm very fortunate to work with them and others. And in this way, we're, piece by piece, putting the puzzle back together as to how ancient these places are, and also the possibility that the very early Egyptians and the very early Peruvian people were in physical contact with each other, as at least via major seafaring ability.
Well, yes, and I suppose if you're going to build something near the coast, surely you've got seafaring ability.
Well, that's an excellent point. The thing is, the central focus of my work now is the area of Paracas, which is just south of Lima by about 4 hours, and that is where we find these intriguing people who had elongated skulls, either through head binding, or possibly some of them were naturally elongated. And we also find evidence of that at Tiwanaku, that these people also had elongated skulls. And there is some belief that the Inca as well had the same physical feature to some degree. So it's quite possible that at least part of the bloodline of the ancient Peruvians came from elsewhere, as well as the fact that we're finding skulls with red hair, and that's very intriguing.
And what does the red hair mean?
Well, a lot of the highest civilizations around the world, the priests and the king queens, or the priest king families, seem to have had this red hair phenomenon happening throughout the Middle East, in Egypt, of course, in Ireland and Scotland, and also in South America, as well as into the Pacific on Easter Island. And it's thought that the first inhabitants of New Zealand, the people before the Maoris, were these red-haired, tall, light-skinned people, not necessarily Europeans, but some obscure race who, we're still trying to find information about who they were.
So, in your research, then, well, actually, let me ask you. I mean, how did you sort of get into the elongated skulls? I mean, where did that come from for you? The connection.
Well, that's a great point. Actually, the thing is that I saw my first examples in Cusco about 5 years ago on my first trip in a very small museum in the basement of the Coricancha, which was the spiritual center of the Inca. There's a small museum, and they have examples of these elongated skulls. And through my studies, of course, with the connections with Tiwanaku, I found out that many skulls there have been unearthed which had elongated skulls, and just gradually traveling closer and closer to the coast of Peru, there's a museum at Ica where they have these monumentally huge ones that have almost twice the cranial capacity of a modern human. And in Paracas, I met a man who has a small private museum, and he had one on display, and I found out that he had 18 more at home. And so he allowed me to not only look at them, but I sort of coaxed him into displaying them at the museum. I was able to take DNA samples from them and ship those samples to Lloyd Pye in the United States, and they're presently being analyzed as to, so that we can find out the genetic characteristics of who these people were.
And do you think you're going to find that?
I think so. I think we're looking at two distinct types of human. I think the elongation by means of cranial manipulation, as in skull binding, was a later characteristic, and that there are examples of humans that had naturally elongated skulls, and they are the oldest of the two groups. But from there, we're very much speculating at this point as to where they came from. Again, we're looking at the characteristics of the red hair and other physical features in the skulls themselves, which I've been told by some experts appear to not be normal human characteristics.
So where did this species go then?
They basically interbred with normal, quote-unquote normal humans, and so the elongation traits gradually died out. The Paracas people who showed the greatest or the largest elongated skulls over a period of time started to interbreed with the Nazca people, and by the time the Nazca, the makers of the Nazca lines, once the Nazca civilization reached its peak, the entire elongation characteristic, whether through binding or whether through natural means, seems to have disappeared. So it seems to be a genetic trait as well as a cultural trait which gradually died out.
And were they from this planet?
That I don't know. I really hate to speculate that they could be, that these people are hybrid humans. It is possible, but that is a stretch at this point. Lloyd Pye, who some will know from the Star Child skull, the Star Child skull is probably the example of a possible hybrid human. He's very convinced that that these elongated skulls are not from this Earth, or at least some of their genetic material is not.
So, are you saying that the elongated skull, does connect with the sort of monolithic structures, that you've been researching?
That's what I and others are starting to believe, that the megaliths were in fact built by a very ancient culture of people. Again, we're moving. We've already started talking about off-world civilizations, and I guess the next one is Atlantis. So it seems possible that there was a race of ancient beings, very small in number, that survived at least one, if not two, major cataclysms, and they fled to some, safe ground, which seems to be, at least in one example, the Paracas area, and the other example may very well be Egypt, and it's there that they took on the role of the great teachers, and they were the constructors of things such as the pyramids at Giza, and also Pumapunku and other, fantastic engineering marvels in the Peru-Bolivia area.
And I suppose for yourself, I mean, it took you a long time to sort of come to this conclusion. You've not just, rushed into this and said, connected dots that aren't there. This is the direction that your researchers took you on.
Well, it has, and again, I'm very hesitant about talking of the there is of course the possibility that it's off-planet beings or people, or even quote unquote Atlanteans, but I don't want to jump into that, because until we have more evidence, of course, I will be attacked by anybody, anybody and everybody, by making such a stretch. But it seems to be leaning in that direction, but I can't, of course, make any definitive conclusions until we have much more data, especially DNA evidence.
Well, exactly, and I mean, you must find with saying something like that, or even some of your research, mainstream academia won't always agree with your findings, will it?
Oh no, they will. They will definitely attack this, and I've learned the lessons again that people such as Graham Hancock have learned, where he has been under attack, for decades by academia for suggesting the possibility that highly evolved cultures existed before the Bible. But I think there are so many of us on the, not just academics, but just people in general, who are starting to very much question our, where it is that we did come from, and believing that a 6,000 to 7,000 year time span for humanity to be evolved is quite ridiculous. So I'm not alone with that, including the guests that we just had from the United Arab Emirates. They had been to Giza, they had been to Baalbek in Lebanon and other places, and they completely are convinced that we as humans and evolved humans go back many thousand years.
So let's just get back to the Inca, and one of the cities I want to just discuss with you, well, if it was a city, I'll get to ask you that in just a second, was Sacsayhuaman. Was that a whole city as such?
No, the general conventional thought is that it was a fortress, but it's the local people of oral tradition that I've spoken with here say that it was it was a great spiritual center, and that was its function during the Inca period, and also farther back in time. There is actually a tunnel which connects Sacsayhuaman with Cusco, which is about 2 miles long underground. I've seen both ends of it, but both ends have been blocked off so that no one's allowed to access the tunnel.
Okay, and at the peak of its civilization, I mean, how many people would have lived there?
Well, in Cusco itself, there were probably 250,000. And the Inca civilization itself, at its peak in 1530, was about 10 to 15 million.
That's a lot of people, and for its time, again, it was quite civilized. I mean, they even had highways, did they not?
Oh, they did, and we're starting to find out that the highway system itself preceded the Inca. The great civilization prior to them were called the Wari, and they were using the road system before the Inca existed. And it's quite possible that the main roads, there's one along the coast and another one in through the Andes that are more or less parallel to one another, going from southeast to northwest, that they could very well be many thousand years old.
I mean, that's quite an intelligent design to build that, isn't it?
It is, and the amazing thing is that the Pan American Highway, which goes down the coast of Peru to this day, is the Inca Road, as well as the major road that goes through the highlands and the Andes. That road is the Inca Road that's used by, buses, trucks, and cars.
And I mean, how long, how sort of far did the highway stretch at that time?
Well, it stretched at least from Quito in Ecuador to the north down to about where Santiago is in Chile. And then the two main roads, which were called the Capacnan, which means royal roads, they were interconnected at many different points, which again are modern day roads. But the whole system is believed to be a total about 30,000 kilometers.
Now, as well, some of these road systems, am I right in saying that some of them actually veered off into cliffs as well?
Actually, not in the case of Peru and Bolivia. What happened was that some of the roads, at least in the highlands in the Andes area, had to cross not major valleys, but they had to cross crevasses and ravines. And so that's where the Inca were ingenious at building rope bridges, which many people will, maybe even remember from Tarzan movies or things like that. These amazing spans of 200 to 300 feet that could carry, very heavy weights. There's only one in existence now, which is rebuilt once a year, but during the height of the Inca Empire, there were many of them. And that was actually one strategy that the Inca used in order to slow down the advance of the Spanish, was by cutting the major rope bridges.
I see, and also another ingenious device they had as well, structure they had, was the rock terrace. Now, just explain for the audience what they are, and do they still use them as well?
Well, the terracing system in general was probably built by the Inca, not necessarily by the cultures that came before, but they are phenomenal in scale. In the Sacred Valley, for example, which is just east of Cusco, some of these terracing systems, which average, each terrace is separated from the next by 6 to 8 feet in height, and they go from the valley floor to the tops of mountains. So some of these terraces are up to at least 2,000 feet in vertical height. And the entire, we were just at Lake Titicaca yesterday, and the entire area of Lake Titicaca, all the hills are terraced, but very few of them are used presently. But it shows that a very large population was present at one time.
Yeah, absolutely. And, is there any sort of myths or legends associated with the Inca sites as well?
Oh, yeah, there are so many of them. But the trouble is that you have to pick through the historic accounts of the Spanish versus the oral accounts or traditions of the Inca. What I've been trying to do is read as much as possible of all the accounts and try to find a central theme or story. But again, it was the first Inca, or the first contact with the Inca, where they stated that places such as Sacsayhuaman and Tiwanaku and Pumapunku were not built by them, but preceded or were built by a much earlier culture who they didn't even have a name for.
And again, this earlier culture, were there any sort of legends of gods living there as well, or gods present there, shall I say?
Well, the most common theme is that there was a race of giants who lived. They were created by the same creator god called Viracocha, who was the creator of the Inca. And Viracocha created this race of giants who were able to build these monstrous megaliths. But then it's very similar to the Bible, he became very unhappy with them because they started to degrade in terms of ethics and morals, and so he destroyed them by means of a great flood.
With the Inca civilization, was there any sort of hieroglyphic records on to view, or was there anything ever sort of writing that was ingrained in the walls or stuff?
Well, that's an excellent question, and that's something I'm researching right now, because the common story is the Inca had no written language, and they only had oral tradition. But what we do know for sure is they had a system called quipus, which were knotted cords. And these were base 10, much like what we have, as in 0 to 9. And so by means of tying knots in these cords of different colors, they had a very brilliant portable accounting system that was able to be moved, anywhere within the civilization. The Inca were emphatic about keeping records of people and houses and the number of llamas that were raised, the volume of crops that were raised in every part of the territory, in order to be able to distribute the wealth during times of famine. But what I've also found is that there was a coded language, hieroglyphic in nature, very similar to, if you look at Mayan or to some degree Egyptian, in terms of their symbols inside of squares. As you would know, in terms of the Egyptians, that sort of block that the symbols are inside of are called cartouches. And in terms of the Maya, I don't know what the name of that is, but it's like a symbol within an outer shape, either a circle or a square. And so these were part of the Inca textile system. And it's only because I was able to find a very obscure little book that was written here in Cusco. And actually today we tried to find a copy, but the only copy I know of is one that David Hatcher Childress has. And it shows the symbols. It was a very syllable-based written language, in terms of each syllable was represented by a symbol, sort of like the way Japanese is written.
So you must find it very difficult then to do your research sometimes, because you've not got a lot of text to go on, have you really?
No, not at all. And but that's the intriguing aspect. I'm always given another little clue to once I feel that I've learned enough about the area, I'm always given a clue which is even much more obscure and much deeper and much more intriguing to follow. So I think it will be a never-ending process.
I mean, was there any great prophets that prophesied that there is information buried somewhere on these ancient civilizations that apparently made these structures? I mean, have you heard of anything like that?
Not really, but again, something that Stephen Mailer told me, who has studied in Egypt for decades, and much of his information is based on a man called Hakim, who was the expert on oral traditions, who died a couple of years ago. Hakim basically said that the structure itself is the teacher. So the more that you study the ancient megalithic structures, they reveal the answers, through geometry, through symbolism, through celestial alignments, through composition, joinery, and things like that. Over time, even though there aren't people necessarily alive who, have the full picture, the megalithic monuments still do have all of the knowledge. It's just a question of repeated trips to them and just, keeping your eyes and mind open.
So how many times do you go and view the monoliths?
This is my 13th trip to Cusco so far, and each trip to each place becomes a deeper investigation. My greatest fear is that I will go to a place such as Sacsayhuaman or Ollantaytambo or Machu Picchu and not see something new. But we were at Machu Picchu 3 days ago, and there were new things that basically revealed themselves to myself and to our guests who were with us.
And what are some of the features that are revealing themselves? What are you discovering?
Well, actually, some of them are quite simple. Some of them are quite obscure. The simplest one was we climbed the mountain which is in behind Machu Picchu, because if anyone looks at a picture of Machu Picchu, they'll see these two hills close right in the background, and they looked like the profile of a human face looking skywards. And so the highest of the two hills is basically the nose, whereas the lower one is the chin. So we climbed the 1,200 stone stairs to the top of what is called Huayna Picchu, and at the very peak, there was a stone that had a slot carved into it. And by staring through that slot, that pointed directly to what is called the Inti Punku, which means the Sun Gate, which is on a distant mountain, and that was a ceremonial and also strategic point for restricting access to Machu Picchu. So that was a simple example. Another example is one of my guests, when we were climbing back up the backside of this mountain, he saw in a small cave these stones that were covered in some kind of white ashy or chalky material, and he recognized, or he didn't know what the symbols were, but he said there were carved symbols. So he has taken photographs, which he's going to email me once he gets back to Dubai in a few days so that I can have a look.
I mean, wouldn't that be incredible for your research, that the actual answers do lie in the monoliths themselves, and that as you carry on this journey that you're on, that you're going to discover something just fantastic, and perhaps they were there all this time, the answers.
I think so, but I don't think they were left. I don't think the clues are left on purpose. There are those who believe that some of these major constructions, such as the Great Pyramids and so forth, were built so that as testimonials or monuments to humanity for us during this age to uncover. I think simply that the great builders naturally left clues as they were building them, and so bit by bit we're starting to discover these, such as what Chris Dunn has found on the Giza Plateau in terms of obvious machining of very hard stone using what he believes are ultrasonic tools. And some of these stones are just scattered in the desert. They aren't necessarily right next to the pyramid or within the there are features within the Great Pyramid that suggest that as well. But there are also these stones that just seem to lie around. But it's taken his engineering eye to be able to see what the average visitor would never notice, such as perfect 90-degree angles or areas where it looks like a spinning, ball-type cutter has cut through the stone to create certain contours.
But like you said, only an engineer would be able to recognize that, and with his engineering eye, he's picked up on these marks, hasn't he?
Oh yeah.
So, it begs the question then: where did the technology go? If it was advanced technology that made these monoliths, where has that ended up? Because it doesn't seem that it's made it into mainstream science. Because our technology only sort of took off in the 40s. So where has this technology come from?
Well, that's a good question, and that's the greatest attack that the skeptics can use is they will say, well, okay, you say that these were cut or carved by machines, so where are the machines? And we are still having difficulty with finding. There are examples of components, but the great machines themselves, no longer exist. But if you are talking, for example, 10,000 years, anything made out of iron would, of course, have rusted and decayed to nothing. Any components made out of gold would have been, if they were found by a later, not as sophisticated culture, any gold or precious components or, diamonds or crystals or anything would have been removed for some other function. And so it's quite probable that any of these machines, once found by a later culture, would have been taken apart and used for different things, scattered, and never to be found again. For example, if you took the engine out of an automobile and took the whole thing apart and spread it over the course of miles through different villages, if one person has a radiator hose, you have you have something that looks odd, but it doesn't give you any indication of what the true function was. But again, Stephen Mailer has found certain things in the Cairo Museum, such as these plates made of incredibly hard stone, which seem to have fin-like projections on them. And he and others have speculated that those plates were part of a machine that spun at incredibly high velocity and possibly were responsible for neutralizing gravity so that the great stones of Giza, for example, could be moved without, the conventional story of slaves and rollers and that sort of thing.
I mean, that's very difficult to get your head round, though, isn't it? I mean, to think that there was advanced civilizations on this planet way before ourselves, or even, more advanced than what we are now. But when we say advanced, do you think the advancement could have been in a very different direction? I mean, as we understand lasers and stuff like that, which you've mentioned before, maybe the technology was different in a way that we can't even begin to understand.
Well, I believe so. The little so far that I've been able to study about Giza, I'm hoping to go in March or April with Stephen Mailer and Chris Dunn to look at the these anomalous structures there. It seems that the ancient people didn't impose upon nature or harness nature the way we do. It seems that they had a much higher or more highly evolved sense of the natural forces, and therefore we're able to, I wouldn't say nurture the forces, but we're able to use the natural forces such as the movement of water, such as magnetics or electromagnetics in a much more, I wouldn't say simple way, but having a higher, more highly evolved sense of how these natural forces worked. They were able to utilize them without imposing the way that we have a tendency to do.
Yeah. So again, more advanced in a sort of spiritual nature as well.
Exactly.
So another sort of direction I wanted to take this in as well was the underground tunnels, because I understand that you've done some research into that as well. Just tell us about the underground system that exists there as well.
Well, the one tunnel that I've seen the openings to, again, is the one that goes from Sacsayhuaman, which is on a hill right to the north of Cusco, down through Cusco, and comes out underneath what is called the Coricancha, which was the spiritual center of the city, which still exists. I've seen the openings, but again, they've been blocked up because the government doesn't want people going in and getting lost. But there are oral traditions of there being tunnels that go from Tiwanaku to Cusco, and another site at Lake Titicaca called Amaru Muru, which means it's an ancient, called like the ancient snake door, and that seems to go to Cusco. And there's even talk of ancient tunnels that go from Lima and underneath the Andes into the Amazon. But again, these are based solely on stories. I have no actual proof that they exist. But the city of Lima, some people, have been led to believe that Lima was founded by the Spanish in 34, but in fact it dates back at least 2,000 years, if not older. There was a culture there that built these huge pyramids out of adobe, which actually still exist, but they simply look like hills. But in fact, if you walk up close to them, they are made of multiple million mud bricks. It's just the modern people who live in Lima don't even give a second thought to them. But, someone from Canada, like me, was completely shocked when I saw the first. And then I naturally started looking for more, and then I started to see more of them.
What drives you? What are you searching for?
Oh, gee, I guess it's just it's the basic central core question of where do we come from as a people. Some people have said, well, it's up to the Inca or the Inca descendants or in the case of Hawaii, the Hawaiians to find this stuff out. But I'm more of a person who looks at humanity as a family of people rather than separating us into cultures. So I simply am fascinated by the history of humanity and where we come from as a species and what is it that we've lost, because that gives us to find the answers gives us the true essence of who we are as beings.
And what do you think we have lost?
I think we've lost the majority of our history. We've had, at least in the Western world, this one doctrine which, for some people, has been forced upon them, which is the Bible, or for others there would be other texts. And, the trouble with those is that the farther back in time you go, the more obscure it is because we aren't given timelines. And so they say approximately, 6,000 years ago, Adam and Eve, existed, or 10,000 or something or whatever. But the story is so illusory and so fragmented that it doesn't give us a clear picture of humanity's origins. And I come from a scientific background, and to some degree I do believe in evolution, but I am actually one who is open to the possibility that there, of interaction with, other life forms from not of this planet. The fact that we may have certain genetic traits which are not from here.
But
the major.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, just I don't know. It's just there's so little we know, and whenever some of these places show up, such as the latest ones in Turkey, which have been dated clearly at 12,000 BC, or the fact that the Sphinx has been dated, thanks to Dr. Robert Schock, being at least 8,000 years, if not 12,000 years old, that initially the mainstream academics just shun the idea, but as we're able to bring more experts in, such as geologists, engineers, etc., who can prove the antiquity of certain sites, it shows that we go back much farther in time than we have, traditionally been told.
So what was a key point for you then to sort of, connect this whole idea that perhaps we've been helped in some way by a race that wasn't initially from this planet? I mean, where does that stem from?
Well, I don't really have, I don't have that strong a belief in it.
No, but as an idea that it's a possibility.
Well, the possibilities I've heard in, the strongest sense I've learned is through the origin traditions or oral traditions of many different people, such as the Hawaiians, some Native American people, some people from Indonesia, the Inca, and others, that the little cluster of stars we call the Pleiades seems to be a source of ancestral genetic genetic content as well as tradition. So that's about as strong as I can go with it. I'm not a great UFO buff. I don't deny that they could exist, but I'm not going to say yes they do, even though I have had sightings. I try to keep myself firmly on a scientific foothold because
Yes.
I don't want to go drift off and either sound like a lunatic. But it's quite easy to do on certain occasions. But there's there, and also Sirius, the Sirius area seems to be very important too, as well as possibly Orion. They are the three that seem to come up over and over again as being, the source of the so-called ancient ones, or where the great, the great high kings go when they die. They go to the heavens. They return. Their spirit returns to some ancient homeland in the sky, and quite often it's specifically the Pleiades or Orion or Sirius.
Okay. And one of my sort of final questions with the Incas was, obviously I grew up with movies. We've all watched the movies of the Inca, and they seemed at some points to be quite a savage race, with the sort of human sacrifices. But would you tend to say that the whole thing with the human sacrifices, it was very minimal?
Well, that is actually completely untrue, and that's based again on extensive research. The only peoples that I know of in the Americas in general were the Aztec, who were very much into human sacrifice about the time that Cortez arrived. There is evidence for that, but the earlier people, the Maya, who lived slightly farther south, they have been accused of being of having major human sacrifice, and the Inca as well. But a lot of that is based on the church manipulating the stories of history in order to debase history so that the descendants of these people would be much easier to convert into that new faith that they brought with them. But amongst the Inca, there are, possibly, I've only heard of, I think, 6 or possibly 10 examples of human sacrifice, not hundreds or thousands. And I believe the same is true amongst the Maya. They've been accused of being, very, great in terms of, or horrific in terms of human sacrifice. But the only documented cases of the Aztec, because their culture was actually in trouble at the time that the Spanish arrived, and so it's believed that the Aztecs were sacrificing human hearts in order to appease such gods as the rain god to bring rain back. And also amongst the Nazca, the Nazca were a culture that collapsed, I believe, about the 7th century A.D., and because of a drought, they sort of lost their wits to some degree, or lost their sense of humanity, and they started to get involved heavily in human sacrifice, again because of a major earth change that stopped the rains. And so in order to appease the rain god, they performed human sacrifice on quite a large scale.
Well, Brien, I found your work to be absolutely fascinating, and we're at the top of the hour right now. So do you have a Facebook page and a YouTube channel where people can get hold of you?
Yes, I do. Actually, my Facebook page and my YouTube channel, it's just you have to write Brien Foerster with the correct spelling. Brien is B-R-I-E-N, and Foerster is F-O-E-R-S-T-E-R. And so my latest 2 websites, one is www.brienfoerster.com, and the other one is Visit Paracas, VISITPARACAS.com. And that covers basically the new information that I'm working on.
Okay, and you also do the tours over there, don't you? You do archaeological tours.
Yes, exactly. That's my company called Hidden Inca Tours, which is www.hiddenincatours.com. And that's where you'll find all not only the information about the tours we give, but I have 530 YouTube videos so far, hundreds of photographs, and a lot of the information on the site is not solely for, selling people tours. It's also just to present information to the public about the history of Peru and Bolivia.
Well, Brien Foerster, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.